We are up 4 inches and we are centered as best we can be here. Yeah, I think that's right. And then I'm going to go that, and here we go. I put my business tag in a spot on this where I had to kind of go a little bit around it, curve around it instead of doing a straight line to sew this on. And it was still fine. It's still encased the raw edge on the other side. It's like you still have a little wiggle room if you need to do something like that.
Okay, while I am installing the snaps, I want to take this time to make a suggestion. If you have a machine that doesn't have a narrow presser foot, it's a domestic, or you're trying to use a walking foot or something like that, if you want to wait to put these snaps in until after you have sewn the side seams together, that is perfectly fine. I'm installing them now, but what you can do if you don't have a narrow foot is skip to the next step where we're sewing these two exterior pieces together, only having put the slits in for the snaps, not having put the snaps in, and then installing the snaps just as I am now through the slits and using the backings behind them. And I'll mention it again when I get to the point where you would do that. But this part is not necessary to do this way. It's just easy for me. It works. I have room to sew the seam. Some people do and some people don't. So just keep that in mind. If you are, say, for instance, trying to use a walking foot, you might want to do that. Like a walking foot on a domestic machine doesn't give you a whole lot of room to sew around these snaps. And just remember that you're installing the male snaps on the exterior piece that has the closure piece and the female snaps on the other exterior.
Now I'm putting the two exterior sides, right sides together and pinning around the whole thing to keep them in place. Although if you have your snaps in already, the snaps actually kind of do that for you a little bit because they snap together. But I'm just pinning them to keep the edges in place, and then I'm going to sew the side seams and the bottom seam, leaving the corners open, those inside corners open. And also, if you do have the snaps in, I recommend using a stapler, just like I'm doing here, to staple inside the seam allowance really close to the edge, just to keep the snaps from, the height of the snaps from pulling the vinyl away from the edge as you're sewing. And again, this is not even necessary if you chose to wait to install the snaps. But we're sewing down one side, we're back stitching when we start and stop, skipping over the corners, the inside corners, sewing across the bottom. Again, back stitching when I start and stop. I didn't even bother cutting my thread, but I still back stitch because I'm going to cut the thread when I finish. And then the other side. Before you go any further, if you didn't install the snaps, now's the time to do it. You can just stick your hand through the top of the bag and slip them through the outside, which is actually the inside right now, and then install them. And then you can move on to boxing the corners, as I'm doing right now. And this part is also kind of important in that it's very helpful, not necessary, but again, really helpful. If you can, press the seams open on both the bottom and the side when you box the corners. Now, I know this is not typical, at least it's not for me. When I am boxing corners and I'm trying to nest seams, I usually make one of the seam allowances go one way and the other seam allowance go the other way and really get those seams nice and nested. But in this case, because of the shaping of the bag later on, it's helpful to do what I'm doing, which is to press the seam open at the bottom, on the side, and the bottom seam. And you'll see why when you get to a later step in the pattern. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to get some leather tape. If you have some, great. If you're using fabric, an iron would do the trick. But what you want to do is you're going to snip a triangle. If you're doing the small, I think it's 3 inches down from the top of the bag, and I think I said 4 for the large, on both sides, on either side. You're going to snip a small triangle, obviously being careful not to snip into your stitching on that side seam, and that's going to be the place where the bag bends. And here's what my triangle looks like. Now I'm taking my leather tape and I'm using it to hold the seam down on each side so that the seam is pressed completely flat, just below, not above, in the area below the triangle, from the triangle down to the bottom. And that's why when you boxed the corners, it was helpful to box them with the seam flat open, because now this entire area of the bag is going to have the seam open, and when we go to shape the bag later, it will bend at the triangle and it won't try to fold back in under the area that triangle is, but it will fold back in where you didn't press, towards the top, towards the magnetic snaps. So that's the idea behind that. Again, if you're using fabric and you don't have leather tape or something to do this, to stick this down, and you're using fabric, just press the seam open. That should be fine. I've done a couple of these without doing this step and they still took shape. But when the testers were working on this, some of them had different results depending on the materials that they were using. And I think that this kind of evens out the results. No matter what material you're using, if you make sure that that area is flattened out, that seam is flattened out where it's supposed to bend outward, and that you have a triangle there to specifically delineate where the bag should bend, you're going to be fine. Okay, we're coming on to another optional part of the pattern. It's not necessary, but it's very helpful. When I made this bag the first couple of times, I didn't bother to do it and it was fine, but I would say it just makes everything easier. And if you're a beginner, I would definitely recommend doing this. I'm turning the bag right side out, and I am going to, this is this part where I'm going to baste the flap to the back exterior of the bag so that it stays in place when we go to sew this whole bag together. I have the flap piece and I'm unsnapping the bag, and I'm matching the center of the flap piece with the center of the back exterior, right sides together. So it's gonna be weird because the handle is in between and trying to push that bag outward, but this is right. You want it right sides together. Clip at the center mark first to keep it in place, and then clip along on either side of that. And then you're going to take this to your machine and you're going to, within the seam allowance, very close to the edge, so you can't use a 1/4 inch seam, use like an 1/8 inch seam, baste this to the back of the bag. Now, when I finish basting, you'll notice that I didn't go from one far edge of the flap to the other. I just started where it was easy for me to start, and ended where I needed to end without going all the way to the edge, and it was enough to keep the flap in place so that it won't shift around from side to side when I go to sew this to the interior.